Good afternoon. Joining me here today are Superintendent of the Maryland State Police, Colonel Jerry Jones, and our Chief Legislative Officer and Senior Counselor to the Governor, Kiefer Mitchell. The murders, shootings, and out-of-control violent crime in the streets of Baltimore has long been the most urgent issue facing the city. But the latest string of heinous crimes over the past few weeks have been particularly disturbing, and it has shaken city residents and community leaders to the core. 10 days ago, in broad daylight, a Catholic priest was assaulted, robbed, and struck in the head with a gun right outside his church in Little Italy. The next afternoon, an armed suspect went on a shooting spree in East Baltimore. He shot 3 people, 2 of them fatally, at 3 separate locations, including a local barbershop. A week ago today, Evelyn Player, a 69-year-old retiree and grandmother, arrived after sunrise at Southern Baptist Church, where she was a longtime member and volunteer. She was found later that morning, stabbed to death in the church bathroom. Last week, Baltimore surpassed the staggering milestone of 300 murders for the 7th straight year. The 300th victim was a 5-year-old girl whose body showed signs of previous abuse. And on Thursday night, a 13-year-old girl was gunned down near a recreation center in West Baltimore. These aren't just stories and statistics. These are lives tragically snuffed out and families that will never be the same. It's heartbreaking, and it's completely unacceptable. The people of Baltimore are hurting. They're scared, and they're searching for answers. They want to know why this bloodshed keeps happening and what it's going to take for something to finally change. This horrifying violence is tearing Baltimore City apart, and enough is enough. Last week, I directed the Maryland State Police and all state law enforcement agencies to immediately provide additional assistance to the Baltimore Police Department and to provide enhanced visibility patrols in an all-hands-on-deck effort. Since then, the state of Maryland initiated more than 550 enhanced visibility patrols by state police agencies into the city of Baltimore over the past 5 days. In addition to the 100% match of all Crime Stoppers rewards that lead to arrests, which we previously announced, we also offered an additional $100,000 reward for the information that leads to the arrest and conviction of those responsible for Evelyn Player's murder. Last month, of course, we announced an additional $150 million of increased support for state and local police agencies to pay for body cameras, de-escalation training, to hire more officers, and provide additional victim services and community policing initiatives all across the state. There's plenty of blame to go around for the lawlessness and violence in Baltimore, but now is not the time for finger-pointing or excuses. What the people of Baltimore City desperately need are answers and action. A few weeks ago, we announced that we would invest another $10 million in the upcoming budget for neighborhood safety grants to support lighting, cameras, hardware upgrades, and increased security services for community organizations, business districts, main streets, and neighborhoods in Baltimore City and all across the state. Today, I'm announcing that we are expediting that funding and making it immediately available. Today, we're also expanding the eligibility requirements to include places of worship and vulnerable communities. But as I have repeatedly said, we also need a prosecutor who will actually prosecute violent criminals. Residents deserve transparency and accountability. And they and all Maryland taxpayers deserve to know that the millions of dollars in funding that the state provides each year are being used to actually prosecute criminals and to keep them off the streets. Effective immediately, I'm directing the Office of Crime Prevention, Youth, and Victim Services to conduct a top-to-bottom evaluation of all funding provided to the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office. All of that state funding will remain pending and under review until that office provides complete data regarding the number of cases they have chosen not to prosecute and why, the number of cases pled down to lesser charges, and the number of violent offenders who are given plea deals. We're also asking the Baltimore Police Department to immediately redouble their tactical efforts in high-crime areas of the city. The state law enforcement officials believe this should include the BPD increasing district, sector, and community patrols and deploying lighting and traffic enforcement measures to increase visibility in known high-crime areas. I am introducing emergency legislation to be submitted during the special session of the legislature, which begins on December 6th, to require tougher sentencing for violent offenders, specifically those who continue to commit violent felonies with guns. In 2021, a staggering 82% of homicide suspects had a prior criminal record. Nearly half had prior gun-related charges and had prior arrests for a crime of violence. And yet, they remain out on the streets, continuing to perpetrate these crimes over and over again. The reality is, no matter what actions we take, Baltimore City will never get control of the violence if they don't arrest more, prosecute more, and sentence more to get the most violent criminals off the streets, and if they can't keep the flood of illegal guns from making it into the hands of these violent criminals. I will be introducing in the special session as emergency legislation the Violent Firearms Offenders Act to significantly tougher penalties for those who use and illegally possess guns, as well as those who supply illegal guns to violent criminals. This legislation includes truth in sentencing provisions, which will require criminals who use guns to commit violent crimes to serve their time consecutively, and it increases penalties for those who use guns to commit violent crimes. The Violent Firearms Offender Act will increase penalties for those who are convicted of illegal possession of a firearm, as well as penalties for convicted gang members who illegally possess firearms. We know that guns used in crimes often do not belong to the offender, which is why our legislation also increases penalties for knowingly and illegally transferring a gun to someone who plans to use it to commit a crime or to cause harm, and increases penalties for those who possess stolen firearms and guns with obliterated serial numbers. The Violent Firearms Offender Act will also increase the minimum penalty for those who knowingly participate in a straw purchase to illegally provide a gun to a prohibited person or to a minor. We will also, again, introduce the Judicial Transparency Act as emergency legislation during the special session. It will require the Maryland State Commission on Criminal Sentencing Policy to track and publish detailed information on the sentences that are handed down by judges for all violent crimes. For 7 years, I have been fighting to bring transparency and accountability to state government. Why should that standard only apply to the executive and legislative branches? It needs to apply to the judicial branch as well. The public has the right to know about the sentences judges are giving or not giving to the most violent offenders. People are being shot nearly every single day in Baltimore City, and we have an obligation to do something about it right now. I want to thank the Maryland Senate for passing these bills in past years. But the House must also take decisive emergency action. An overwhelming majority of Baltimore City residents and all Marylanders strongly support these bills. We have all waited long enough. We have reached out to Mayor Scott to set up a meeting, and today we are once again asking city leaders and the city delegation to stop working against this legislation and to work together with us to expeditiously pass this emergency legislation. On Thursday, families across Maryland and across America will gather together to celebrate Thanksgiving. For the family of Evelyn Player and the families of the more than 300 we have lost this year, it will be a long and very difficult holiday season. And I ask all Marylanders to keep them in your prayers, but prayers are not enough. With all of the actions that we've announced here today, I want those families and all of the victims of this violence to know that we will not stop pursuing those criminals who are terrorizing our community, and we will continue to use every tool at our disposal to make these neighborhoods safer and to get these violent shooters off the streets. With that, I'd be happy to take a few questions.
I know you've heard the board in office has heard, and some people will say, well, we don't need more police officers. We need more money for various social services, schools, et cetera, et cetera. What do you say to some of the individuals that say, well, this is not doing that?
Yeah, I think we've invested something like $5 billion into the city of Baltimore to address some of the root causes of crime. But I'm concerned about people getting shot this week and this weekend, and that doesn't do anything to stop that. You know, an overwhelming majority of Marylanders, an overwhelming majority of people in Baltimore City support all three of these pieces of legislation. The recent polling shows something like 88% of the people in Baltimore City agree with us. Nationwide, 75% I think we should have more funding for police. So I know there are a couple of Baltimore City council members that want to eliminate the police department. I can tell you almost no one agrees with them.
Governor, Prince George's, you're talking about Baltimore City. Prince George's County is experiencing 50% increase in homicides this year, 100% over 2019, 300% increase in carjackings, jump-in carjacks. Same thing. Yesterday, I covered a young mom with a child next to her who was shot in the head and killed. You're talking about Baltimore City. What about Prince George's County? Is that going to be part of your focus here?
Yeah. Great question. First of all, murders and violent crime are up all across America by those kind of staggering numbers. Prince George's County obviously is also seeing an increase. Prince George's County is about 50% larger than Baltimore City and has 1/3 of the murder. So I'm not trying to diminish the severity of the problem. It is getting worse. It's not nearly as bad as Baltimore, but it is a serious problem, and it's the second largest problem we have in the state. But every single one of the things we talked about, even though I kind of focused in on the city, every one of these pieces of legislation, all of this funding, all of the increased support for local police applies to Prince George's County just as it does Baltimore City and all of our other 24 jurisdictions.
Governor, why is it so difficult to get a meeting with the mayor? The mayor says he wants to meet with you. You say you want to meet with the mayor. You can't get it together.
It's not difficult to meet with the mayor. We reached out to him today, and I think we're gonna meet with him.
But you haven't. I mean, this has been going on. The dialogue saying we want to meet. We want to meet.
I've seen that. No, that's not true. I mean, we've met with the mayor before on crime. He sat down and went through his 5-year plan, and we responded to it and said we still needed to do some things to take immediate action. I've been with the mayor a dozen times since then, and we're going to have another meeting. There's no issue between that.
Governor, a couple of things. When it comes to this immediate plan, why now? I guess that I know that we crossed the 300 mark in Baltimore City. A lot of people could see this coming. Why not make these announcements sooner? And can you explain a little bit more about the Baltimore City State's Attorney's aspect of the announcement?
Sure. I mean, why now? I mean, this is not a new thing. All of these pieces of legislation we've introduced year after year after year. The reason we're announcing it now, number one, we're outraged by the past 10 days of violence in the city, which is kind of the most heart-wrenching I've seen in the 7 years I've been here. And because we have a special session that we've called to start on December 6th. And we want the legislature to take this up as emergency legislation rather than waiting until, January or February or March to try to argue about these bills. We think we need to do it immediately. I'm sorry, what was the
State's attorney's office, you said you want a review of that?
Yeah,
And the state funding?
the Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention has been compiling data all across the state with respect to sentencing, and we haven't gotten data from Baltimore City, and this is going to require them to respond to the state before they get additional funding.
So the impact on the actual funds, will this impact the availability of funds for the state attorney's office? Are you freezing state funding?
I think right now, we do put a lot of money into there. We just want to make sure that the state taxpayers are getting their money's worth. And so we're not really freezing it, but we're doing an immediate review. And we're hoping that we'll get the cooperation we need out of the state's attorney's office. If not, then it may get to the point where we will have to withhold funding.
Governor, you mentioned about the judicial review. Any thoughts about that sentence that came out about the Baltimore County officer, the one-day sentence?
This is a concern I've had for a long time. And one of the reasons why we pushed the Judicial Transparency Act, because, I think there's a lot of flexibility in what judges do on sentencing. We just want to know exactly, the people have a right to know what they are and what they aren't doing. Obviously, that particular case is one that's very concerning, but there are literally hundreds of ones just like that we're just as concerned about. So we want to get to the bottom of it and get the data. The judicial system opposed this bill. I think over 90% of the people in Maryland support the bill, and we're going to push to get it done.
You also mentioned about taking a look, as we addressed about the state's attorney's office in Baltimore City. We've all heard a lot of, all the way from Baltimore City politicians all the way up to you about maybe the lack of action from the state's attorney's office. Is there anything in your toolbox that you can do to interrupt or intervene with that to maybe to get some progress?
Well, we've tried a number of things. People come up to me and say, can you fire the state's attorney in Baltimore City? And I say, no, only you can do that, to people in the city. She doesn't work for us. She works for the citizens of Baltimore. But we've been trying to take various actions. One thing we did was we tried to push more of the gun crimes to the U.S. attorney. State actually pays for federal prosecutors in the U.S. attorney's office so they can process, Project Exile and gun crimes, because the city wasn't doing a good job of it. The Attorney General agreed to try to take over the prosecution of some of the violent crimes in Baltimore City, and we put 50 more prosecutors into his office, but then it was killed by the legislature because the state's attorney and city delegation was opposed to it. Now we're saying we're going to do a complete review of their cases, and if we have to, we may have to withhold funding until we get the answers and the actions that we need. So we're going to take whatever actions we can to help, but it's not something in our direct control, or we already would have fixed it by now.
Will both Mosbys be invited to these discussions with the mayor?
The meeting with the mayor is just going to be with the mayor. We want to have we don't want a dog and pony show. We want to have a real discussion about what we can do about taking immediate action on the violent crime.
Governor, would you elaborate on the state police helping enforce in the city? Are these vehicle patrols? Are they actual patrol patrols? Are they teaming up? What are they doing?
It's not just the state police, actually. It's all 5 of our state police agencies have been doing increased patrols more than they normally do. So they're actually, you're seeing state police vehicles from 5 agencies driving through some of these dangerous neighborhoods, which provides more of a presence. And there are a lot of things that we work on an ongoing basis with respect to helping process warrants. We do surges from time to time where we send people in, but right now this is a huge increase in the visibility the state can't take the place of the Baltimore City Police Department, and they're actually bigger than the state police. They have more people, and that's not what our guys are trained for. But in this particular case, just getting them in there to do some patrols to help, provide some backup for the overwhelmed city police department is what we're trying to do.
Governor, do you think that the state's attorney, the police commissioner, and the mayor are capable of doing this job right now?
I said earlier I didn't want to point fingers because I'd rather focus on solutions. Obviously, the job isn't getting done. I don't want to, say who's not getting the job done, but I'd like to figure out a way for us to come together and everybody do a better job.
Do you have a date for that meeting yet?
What's that?
Do you have a date for the meeting today?
I think we just reached out to him this morning, and I know our schedulers are working, but sometime in the next week or two, I guess we'll try to get together.
Last question?
On a different topic, the president yesterday threw some barbs at you while endorsing Dan's delegate Cox for governor, and implying that your Secretary of Commerce is not qualified to be the nominee because of her affiliation with you. Do you plan on getting involved in the race? Do you plan on endorsing Secretary Schultz? Do you plan on campaigning for her?
So, Secretary Schultz has done an incredible job for us for the past 7 years. She's been a friend for a long time, served in the legislature admirably, was a small business owner. Terrific job as our labor secretary, commerce secretary. She would make a great governor. I fully intend to get involved in helping her. Dan Cox, the guy that we were hearing about yesterday, is a QAnon whack job. Who was in favor of, I think, calling Mike Pence, my friend Mike Pence, a traitor when they were talking about hanging him. So it's a pretty clear choice. The Goucher poll came out last week saying a Republican like Hogan would beat a progressive Democrat by 20 points and would beat a moderate Democrat by 5 points. A Republican like Trump would lose 69-29, I think was the number. So, but yeah, at some point we'll definitely be having a further announcement about that. I thought, this is not just happening in Maryland. We had a big meeting of the Governors Association, Republican governors last week, where all of the governors discussed this problem. I think the president is attacking 6 or 7 sitting governors and 30-some members of Congress. I think it's really bad for the party. I think it's bad for Donald Trump. We're going to continue to push back. But the voters of Maryland are going to make their own decision about who they think the next governor should be, and I'm pretty sure it's not going to be the crazy QAnon guy.
Thank you.
Thank you.